Hi friends, my name is Kara, and if you haven't stopped in before, welcome to the Little Mission Garden. It's been 4 months since I did my first introductory video, and I wanted to do another video to update you on the progress that I've been making and also to introduce you to some of the gardening methods I've been experimenting with. I live in southern Arizona where it's very hot and dry from May through October. We do get a monsoon season, July through September, but I knew I needed to find a way to garden that used as little water as possible. I wanted to find a way to grow as much in the space I have as possible. It's important to me for health and environmental reasons to be able to grow as much of my own produce as I can. I don't want to buy lettuce that's been fertilized, irrigated, sprayed with pesticides, grown out of season, and shipped from someplace far away before it gets to my table. It was also important to me to find a way to garden that was as time efficient as possible. Like many of you, I work and I don't have hours of time to spend watering and weeding and doing all of the things that a huge garden often requires. So I wanted to find a way to minimize the work and maximize the space. I guess that's a tall order for a little desert garden, but I was determined to find a way to meet all three of these requirements. I started with a very bleak and blank slate. Not much of anything was growing here, except for a seasonal explosion of wild amaranth. I brought my stock tank garden with me from my old house, but I also wanted to have an in-ground garden so I could have more space. The first thing I did was take some soil samples. I sent the samples into a local lab to get an initial view of how good or bad the soil was and what kinds of amendments I would need to add. I received the soil test results a few days later, with recommendations and a breakdown of my soil profile. I'll link the lab I used in the description box below in case any of you are local. To my surprise, I didn't need to add much. I mixed up those few things, added it to the garden beds, and started thinking about what gardening method would give me the best chance for success. I had a few expectations. I read a book by one of my favorite authors, Gary Nabhan, an ethnobotanist in the Southwest. The U.S. Forest Service gives this definition of ethnobotany. In case you're wondering, ethnobotany is the study of how people of a particular culture and region make use of indigenous native plants. The book is entitled Growing Food in a Hotter, Drier Land. It was published in 2013. I'll link that book in the description box below. It's through Gary Nabhan's book that I learned about all of the different methods for growing vegetables and fruit orchards in an arid desert climate. The Sonoran Desert is the most biodiverse desert on Earth, and I feel so fortunate to live here. I was amazed at how so many cultures have been able to grow productive gardens in arid climates, and I wanted to try to experiment with some of them to see if I could find one that would work well for me here. I'll do my best to pronounce these. Zai pits in Africa. This is a technique used in the arid regions of Africa by digging a pit 7 to 12 inches deep and wide. These pits are placed 3 feet from each other and filled with compost and manure. The pits catch rain in the wet season and hold that moisture. There are different names for this method depending on the location. Terraced gardens in Oman and Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula. These took advantage of steep hillsides by building garden beds into them. Any rainfall would be caught in these terraced beds as the water moved by gravity down the hillside. There it could be stored in the soil through the season. Living fence rows in northern Mexico. Farmers made these by planting cottonwood and willow trees along edges of fields and weaving materials such as branches and trunks in between to serve as a filter for floodwaters during seasonal rain. Fertile water and fine debris washed in from seasonal flooding to be retained in the field. Waffle gardens used in the Zuni Pueblo of New Mexico, and basin beds used by the Indigenous Peoples of southern Arizona. Basin beds were used by Indigenous people in this part of the Southwest. They're the opposite of raised beds, so they're recessed beds. So you dig down a few inches, all of the water that you add to the bed stays in the bed, and you have very little, if any, water runoff. I'm sure many of you have heard of the square foot gardening method, which was introduced in 1981 on a wide scale when Mel Bartholomew published his book, Square Foot Gardening. In this book, Mel Bartholomew introduced a simple method to save time, effort, and space in the garden. Instead of long rows and wide paths between, he focused on using a 4-foot by 4-foot square to grow intensively in a small space. Bartholomew did this not only through the 4x4 design, but also through practices of intercropping, succession planting, and amending the soil along the way. I'll cover those practices in a later video. If you haven't read this book, have a small space, a small budget, or a busy life, I highly recommend it. I found it at the local library and later picked up a copy at a local used bookstore. Remember all that wild amaranth I mentioned earlier? Well, it and all the other weeds had to be removed before I could start the garden beds. The easiest way to remove weeds from a large area is by using a method called occultation. In this method, you cover an area with an opaque silage tarp. Occultation is similar to solarizing, the difference being that clear plastic tarp is used for solarizing. Leave the tarp in place for 6 weeks. The process can be sped up by tilling and then watering the area before laying down the tarp. This causes all those unwanted weed seeds to germinate and then cook under the heat of the tarp, using the solar energy instead of your back. After 6 weeks, the weeds and seeds should be dead and decomposing. After this, you can till all of that debris and decomposing plant matter right into your garden bed. I covered the area directly around the garden beds with landscape fabric and wood chips. This is optional. I didn't want to worry about having to weed the paths and the perimeter around the garden. I planned just 4 beds to start. I measured out and marked an exact 4-foot by 4-foot square for each of them. I dug down 6 inches and removed that soil. I mixed the native soil with compost in a 50-50 mix, and then I filled the beds with a little of that mixture. I ended up with a bed recessed by about 4 inches. To save myself time in measuring out 1-foot squares in each of those garden beds, I decided to build myself a template that I could use in each bed. 1, it's going to get eaten up by the UV out here and it's going to break apart. 2, it's more expensive because I have to buy the materials for each one of those square templates. And 3, it's going to take a lot more time. I decided to just build 1 and then put it in each of the beds at the time of planting. That would solve my measuring problem. Plant all of the plants in the beds and then remove that grid and use it in the next bed and the next bed. I used 4-foot long green plastic garden stakes, measured and marked 1-foot sections, and fastened them with outdoor rated zip ties that would withstand the high UV here better. I got busy selecting varieties of plants that were well suited to this region of southern Arizona. I tried to plan out a polyculture of sorts, which is simply growing different varieties of plants together. I planted herbs and flowers amongst my vegetables, hoping that this would give a habitat to many pollinators and beneficial insects. Next, I added mulch to the top to prevent moisture loss. I'll cover mulching the garden in another video. I use shade cloth when planting out new seedlings. The sun here is really intense, and it takes those little seedlings a while to toughen up. Shade cloth is also important here in certain seasons for established plants. Overall, I think this method has been really successful. I've only had to water my garden twice a week during the hottest and driest part of the season, and it's been really productive. I've been able to harvest a ton of vegetables out of the garden, and of course I've learned some lessons. Every year brings challenges in the form of different pests and different types of environmental conditions, but I think that's the case with any gardener. Every season we learn something, usually by failure, and certainly I've had a few failures this year that I will talk about in later videos so that you can hopefully learn from my mistakes. I'm eagerly awaiting the pumpkin harvest, hopefully at the end of October or early November. I'll leave you all with some footage of the garden as it progressed through the season. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now. If you have a small space, even just one of these garden beds can allow you to grow a surprising amount of food. If you have a small budget, this method might help you build a garden that you otherwise couldn't afford. All of those materials for raised beds aren't cheap. If you're short on time, gardening this way can be done in just a few minutes a day. I hope this encourages you that any space, no matter the size, no matter the climate, no matter your budget or your time constraints, can be a place for you to sow your dreams.